Good evening. This is David Traub, co-founder of Save Our Sites. We welcome you to our winter special event on Zoom. Tonight we have Dana Rice, Maya Thomas, and Chris Mulford, who will present an illustrated lecture discussing their joint effort to restore the house of famous African-American Philadelphia artist Dox Thrash at 2330 Cecil B. Moore Avenue in North Philadelphia, not far from where I'm speaking, near 20th and Girard on Cambridge Street. All three are graduates of the University of Pennsylvania in architecture and historic preservation. Rice, Thomas, and Moore have been working in close coordination with a developer in a way which might serve as a model for future preservation efforts, and they will tell you about it. Additionally, we have a special guest, Miss Ollie Davis, who has been working along the way with the other three. She's not identified on the flyer, but here she is tonight. Ollie works for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. She's also a graduate in preservation of the University of Pennsylvania. So now I'm just going to get out of the way and turn it over to our four guests. They're going to give a PowerPoint presentation. After that, there will be a Q&A period. Our staff member and Zoom master, David Safa, who will introduce himself later, will conduct the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. We are the Dox Thrash House project group, as David said, and we're going to present our project. There we go. All right, so a little bit about Dox Thrash. Dox Thrash was born in Griffith, Georgia in 1893. Dox Thrash was one of four children. His mother, Ophelia, worked 6 days a week as a domestic worker for a local white family. The Thrash lived in a former slave cabin in a very rural area. His childhood events influenced many of his future works, including Cabin Days, which is a mezzotint that he did in 1938, excuse me. By age 14, Dox begins taking art courses by mail. He left school after the 4th grade to start working and help support the family. But by 1908, he leaves home and joins a traveling vaudeville act to travel the country and look for better opportunities. Between 1910 and 1917, he's on the road. During these years, he continues his art studies through mail correspondence. There weren't very many schools at the time that would accept Black students to study art, but after arriving in Chicago, he begins working as an elevator operator and is able to start taking classes in the evenings at the Art Institute of Chicago. During this time, almost 2 million African Americans were leaving the South to the northern cities in the hopes of finding better opportunities. His watercolor work, A New Day, reflects the hope and optimism felt by many who were seeking new worlds in the North at the time. In 1917, the US enters World War I, and Thrash leaves his studies to join the military at the age of 24. He is in France fighting in the trenches with a segregated unit. Less than a year later, the armistice is signed, and Thrash is transferred to a hospital in France to recover after being heavily gassed and shell-shocked. He returns to the United States and rejoins the traveling performing act for a few months before returning to his studies in Chicago. Thrash returns home to a country that is deeply divided and segregated, teeming with racial tensions and violence. In 1 year alone, 76 individuals are lynched. Despite this, Thrash, now eligible for government funding from his military services, returns to his studies at the Art Institute of Chicago. Thrash now studies full-time and dedicates his next 3 years to learning art. He learns lettering, commercial art, posters, decorative composition, and mural design. He also receives mentorship from alumnus and fellow Black artist William Edward Scott. Scott was known for his portraits and depictions of African Americans that challenged the subjugated depictions that were typically seen at this time. Perhaps influenced by Scott, Thrash finishes his studies in Chicago and plans to continue his travels to document and explore the daily life of Black Americans throughout the country. After traveling cross-country and brief stints in Boston and Harlem, Thrash finally lands in Philadelphia in 1926. He says that he later departed from New York for another cross-country journey, but didn't get any further than Philadelphia, and he has remained there ever since. Dox Thrash arrives in Philadelphia and finds a home in Charswood. He finds a community of talented Black artists and musicians leading a cultural revolution in Philadelphia that would rival Harlem in New York. By 1929, Thrash is living in an apartment on Columbia Avenue, now Cecil B. And despite the Great Depression, Thrash finds opportunities in graphic design, commercial sign making, and small printing. Becoming more interested in printmaking as an art form, Thrash joins the Graphic Sketch Club, now the Samuel S. Fleischer Art Memorial, to learn etching from Earl Horder, who was a prize-winning printmaker. In 1931, Thrash debuts his first solo exhibition sponsored by the Traw Club, an art association of African American artists in Philadelphia. His work is met with wide acclaim, and his second solo exhibition is hosted just 2 years later. The neighborhood Thrash arrived in the 1920s was teeming with culture and creativity. During the Great Migration, the demographics of Charswood shifted from being a predominantly white neighborhood to Black. Where much of the city was segregated, the neighborhood became a thriving place for Black artists to live and work. You can see at that time that Charswood was built up mostly of row homes, and there's a few familiar things such as Athletic Square and Girard College that we all are familiar with today, but there is also a bunch of other institutions, especially along Columbia Avenue and Ridge Avenue, that like the Pearl Theater and the Checker Club became really important hubs of music, and there was lots of other clubs and hotels and things like that. And of course, the Dox Thrash House is up here on Columbia Avenue, and then the Pyramid Club down on Girard, which we'll talk about a little bit. So the Pearl. The Pearl Theater on Ridge Avenue was one of the premier venues to see jazz singers and hosted artists such as Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, Louis Armstrong, and Pearl Bailey, who also grew up in the neighborhood. Many hotels and clubs sprang up in the vicinity to cater to those traveling to see shows at the Pearl. And you can see a photo of it here, and this would be Ridge Avenue. The Pyramid Club was founded in 1937 by prominent Black professionals in the neighborhood to support cultural, civic, and social advancement of Black people in the Philadelphia. Dox Thrash was a prominent member of the Pyramid Club and gave back significantly to his community through this organization. The club sponsored exhibitions, helped local entrepreneurs, provided space for discussions and social issues. They kind of floated around a bit, but eventually landed on a permanent location which was a former brownstone mansion at 1517 Girard Avenue, which still stands today. In 1937, the Fine Print Workshop was formed along Broad Avenue, a chapter of the Federal Arts Project, which was a New Deal program under the Works Progress Administration. Dox Thrash is the first Black artist to join the workshop, but is soon joined by others in the city. The project was federally funded, so none of the works produced in the program were to be sold, but were to be exhibited for the public and on display in public spaces. He was given almost complete artistic freedom. He, alongside his colleagues Hubert Hessebov and Michael Gallagher, developed a new printmaking technique called the carborundum mezzotint process. This enables Thrash to get a depth of hue and shadow in his prints and lends to an ethereal quality that is not achievable in other forms of printmaking. So you can see a photo of him here at the fine print workshop, as well as an example. This is one of his earlier carborundum prints, and you can kind of see it almost looks like a charcoal drawing because it has so much value in it. So in 1938, the trio unveiled their work in one of the largest exhibitions put on by the FAP in Philadelphia, hosted by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Through the WPA, the carborundum prints are exhibited at the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Later that same year, where the new process of printmaking is finally recognized by the media, bringing fame and acclaim to all three artists. Thrash's work is celebrated nationally, and it goes on to be exhibited around the country, including Baltimore, again in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and is specifically recognized by a report to President Roosevelt. In 1941, the U.S. enters World War II, and the WPA is repurposed for defense work. A veteran himself, Thrash readily takes up the new wartime theme and develops several works, including Defense Worker and Shipfitters, which mimic the ethos of the era. In 1942 is the largest solo exhibition of his career, which is hosted at Howard University in Washington, D.C. A proud veteran, though, Thrash decides to leave the fine print workshop to take up a civil defense job. He applies to the Navy Yard to be an insignia painter in the airplane department, but is denied a position there because of his race. He is offered less desirable work, but refuses. He writes a letter to the Fair Employment Practice Committee in Washington, D.C., in which he says, "I am writing you this to say that I am vitally interested in the outcome of this war and am not concerned in racial prejudices. I want to serve in the capacity for which I am best fitted. That is why I asked for this blank. I shall expect to at least be given a chance to compete with others for the job." In 1943, the federal arts programs are disbanded in order to reallocate resources towards the war. Thrash continues to be exhibited by the Pyramid Club and throughout the country. In 1945, Thrash takes a job as a house painter for the PHA and purchases a house at 2340 West Columbia Avenue, which is the house that we've been working with. He keeps his old apartment just down the street, which he operates as a studio for him and his colleague, Sam Brown. In 1948, Thrash is given a solo exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution. This exhibition is the last major print show of his lifetime. The exhibit features 23 carborundum prints, 9 aquatints, and 4 etchings. In the 1950s, now heading into his 60s, Thrash remains an active and well-regarded member of the Pyramid Club and supports artists in the community. In 1959, Thrash and his wife, Edna, sell their home and move to an apartment on North Broad Street. Thrash and Sam then relocate their studio to Ridge Avenue. On April 19, 1965, after judging a children's poster contest at the Hawthorne Housing Project at 12th and Catherine Street, Thrash is rushed to the hospital after suffering a heart attack in a taxi on the way home. He dies in the waiting room. So that was Dox Thrash's life. So looking at some of his works, these are 2 portraits that he did using the carborundum process. In a quote from him about the process, he says, "I got some of the carborundum powder they used in grinding lithograph stones and rubbed it into a copper plate with an old flat iron. I got a clear rough surface. Well, this fellow Masabov looks over my shoulder and says, 'Hey, I bet you could work lines into that.' So I took a burnisher, a knife-like tool, and sketched a nude." So, and he called the process Ophelia printing after his mother. And in a newspaper review from one of his exhibits of the process, the reviewer writes, "The deep atmospheric tones possible in the carborundum mezzotint are particularly congenial to Thrash's emotional yet sensitive understanding of life." So you kind of can see, he painted, I think, like his mentors, Edward Scott, he did a lot of portraits, particularly of folks from the neighborhood. This is a watercolor example that he did. And this is a lithograph. But he also did street scenes. And so you can see a few cityscapes here that he did of Philadelphia. So now Allie is going to start to talk to us about the house itself.
Yeah, so to recap up to this point, the house itself is located at 2340 Columbia Avenue. It was originally built in 1895 as part of a continuous span of row houses by a developer named Harold Godwin. He created these as aspiring middle-class mixed-use housing with a pleasing and unified facade design. Dox and his wife Edna bought 2340 in 1944. By 1955, Dox was celebrated as a member of the community, and when he retires, he sold his house to another local activist named Shah Muhammad. Next slide. So little is known about Shah Muhammad's early life, except that he was born in North Carolina and joined the Nation of Islam in the 1940s or 50s. Shortly after moving to Philly, Shah Muhammad established the African Asian Cultural Center and the National Muslim Improvement Association. He ran these out of two properties that are located next to what is now the Dox Thrash House on Columbia Ave, and he rented these out as his cultural and religious centers. In 1959, Shah Muhammad purchases 2340 from Dox and Edna Thrash, and he gets to live next door while he runs his two centers. Like Thrash, Shah Muhammad became well known and within the tight-knit Sharswood community during a period of great economic struggle and political upheaval resulting from racist public policies and social practices. By the 1960s, disinvestment by the city in the community's public services like schools, roads, and transportations resulted in the closure of many of the cultural venues and shops. One exception to this was the public library, which is now the Cecil B branch, which opened up just a few houses down from the Dox Thrash House. In August 1964, an uprising broke out on Columbia Avenue in response to a police brutality incident. A multi-day police occupation of North Philadelphia ended after Philadelphia NAACP President Cecil B. Moore, among others, worked to quell the crowds. During the police occupation, Shah Muhammad's home and both his organizational headquarters were raided by the police. The police claimed to have found weapons and ingredients for Molotov cocktails, and Shah Muhammad was tried and charged for his part in inciting the riot. Cecil B. Moore represented him during the trial and was able to get him acquitted. After his acquittal, Shah Muhammad continued to be a prominent member of Sharswood. He formally purchased the two buildings that he was renting for his two cultural centers, and he bought these in 1973. Next slide, please. In 1980, Shah Muhammad received the Cecil B. Moore Community Improvement Award for his work in Sharswood. When he dies in 2002, unfortunately, his properties are left with tangled titles. And the Dox Thrash, what is now the Dox Thrash House at 2340, sat vacant until the Dox Thrash House project came along. We were able to raise support and save the house. And we were able to get Beach Community Services to acquire it in 2020. Now we'll move on, and Chris will tell us about what's going on presently.
Hi, Allie. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. This is another aerial map of the Sharswood neighborhood, pretty recent photo. But, if you kind of like take back and remember the image that Dana showed us from circa 1925, kind of, at reaching the golden age of the cultural legacy of the neighborhood, there's a lot of missing pieces, a lot of holes in the fabric now, and it's very much not continuous, very kind of sparse with significant missing homes, and all the theaters and clubs and sort of all the amenities that all the culture could sort of use as a medium are gone too. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a diagram of, you know, the neighborhood in 2008, and it kind of shows the extent really of, you know, what had been lost in the neighborhood. And, you know, through lots of various means, kind of due to the extent of it, the Philadelphia Housing Authority acquired a lot of these lots, sort of as an ability to sort of master plan the whole neighborhood. And, you know, while this definitely is not stopping gentrification or development, it kind of has had this weird side effect where, you know, now acquisition kind of has to go through the housing authority. And go to the next slide, please. You know, what this kind of does is create a bubble with all of the developing neighborhoods around it. You know, now with a lot of those build outs happening, you know, people are noticing, you know, the Sharswood neighborhood, and where, you know, the additional pressure of development now is, you know, whatever tangible, you know, pieces are left, you know, they have the chance of going away, but then also, you know, the disruption of, you know, pushing people that live in the neighborhood out that are part of the living memory of these legacies. It becomes harder for them to hold on as well. So lots of pressures on the neighborhood. Go to the next slide. This is a photo of the house from a few years ago, and the Dox Thrash House is the second one from the end. The corner lot is now vacant, and you can see the adjacent buildings that Shah Muhammad owned that are again adjacent to the library, Cecil B Library on the left. The first floor of the house historically operated independently from the upper floors. The upper floors of the Dox Thrash House were primarily like a residence, and the first floor, you know, kind of, you know, held more of a commercial or gathering use. In 2018, the lot had been vacant for 15 years, and L&I at that point in time, because of the decaying nature of the structure, issued an unsafe structures violation. And this was also the time kind of at the when the house went up for a sheriff's sale due to delinquent taxes. And then, you know, through that, a outside New York developer, you know, that kind of develops projects kind of small scale as more of a hobby, bought the property sight unseen, and, you know, had no idea of the historic nature, and, you know, also had no idea of, you know, the nature of the structure given the issues with L&I. And, you know, is kind of luckily, you know, because of the local designation of the house, and because of, you know, sort of the efforts of, you know, just talking about Dox Thrash and its history, he was able to search and find out, you know, information about this house, which quickly led him to be like, I don't want to be the person that, you know, is the one responsible for demolishing this house, and therefore was able to get in contact with us, and eventually, you know, kind of keep the relationship with Beach open to eventually lead to Beach acquiring the property. If you go to the next slide, please. You know, he didn't get away, you know, without doing anything. You know, once he owned the property, you know, the city wasn't going to let him, you know, have any kind of sale of the property until he had satisfied the unsafe conditions. And, you know, so he had hired an engineer and a local contractor, and, you know, in the end, a stabilization effort happened, but a lot of the house, you know, in the end was taken away. And what you see now really is just like kind of a stabilized, you know, front facade and partial wall. But, you know, the front facade still, if you go to the next slide, please, we can see some of the details, you know, that are, you know, really kind of still make this building, even, you know, with its legacy, kind of very special. with the relief terracottas, brick, which has motifs of griffins sort of all over the building up there at the top on the cornice and sort of on the underside of this bay window. And then again with the leaded glass, very ornate, on that commercial part we were talking about. And so this combined with the legacy is kind of what we're really after to help preserve. If you go to the next slide, when these kind of things get lost, we are always aware that the building might not be there, and so some other examples like in the neighborhood is like what happens is a lot of times a mural is put up. This is we were looking at the Pearl Bailey Theater. This is the Pearl Bailey mural located on Ridge Avenue, not far from where the original theater stood. And while this is a good way of helping promote education of legacy of neighborhoods, it's not always foolproof because development does creep along. If you go to the next slide, this is the former latest Dox Thrash mural. There have been several. I believe this has been painted over and changed now, but it was covered up originally by this development on the right here. And while the actual buildings are going on, the challenge of preservation today is to figure out how to best preserve these legacies. And it's in an atmosphere, if you go to the next slide, of a lot of demolition, and to kind of put to pair up a very established neighborhood cultural legacy with a physical building is always something very impactful. But you can see on the left, these are the number of demolitions compared to historically preserved sites. And I think the diagram on the right shows most of all is like the effort of preservation has been historically just around the very center of the city, while a lot of these neighborhood legacies and that are important in these outlying neighborhoods are out there, but just are less known. And to the next slide, right here in Philadelphia, there are some very small grassroots type preservation efforts that are wonderful and have been going on. The John Coltrane House, an ongoing effort with that recognized house with status, the Sun newspaper building, the Pearl Bailey House. And not only do these things kind of just stay vacant, or they also kind of have started to help give back, such as the Paul Robeson House Museum and the Mary Anderson House, and is very in line with where we hope the Dox Thrash House goes, to be some sort of institution that gives back in some sort of way, and in line with the legacy of the people that have occupied the house. And I think we'll give it back to Allie to talk a little bit more about some stuff that we've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So the legacy portion of trying to preserve what's left of Dox in the neighborhood, we began with a small social media campaign to get the word out about the history and conditions of the house. It culminated into several Sharswood Thrash workshops that we had hosted with the Community Futures Lab. Although we had prepared some activities, we found that a brief presentation on the history of Dox Thrash was enough to get people engaged in talking about the possibilities for the property. These discussions became the groundwork for future activities focusing on the present goals of the project. In the next slide, what we heard was that Dox Thrash has an important legacy in the neighborhood from the people there. So more needs to be done for future generations to connect his narrative to ongoing developments in Sharswood future. Programmatically, the Sharswood Thrash meetings identified a desire for the house to be a resource to the community, also dedicated in some way to the arts. It's also important to use the opportunities to connect the legacy of Dox Thrash with additional spaces in the neighborhood And so one goal we had was to expand our impact of the project beyond just the physical space of the building, but we also, for example, benefit from other nearby institutions such as the Free Library. And in the next slide, we'll see we've done just that. Most recently this summer and this fall, we had some activities participating with the library's mutual aid fair, and as well, the Free Library had an exhibit on the New Deal, which they called For the Greatest Number, the New Deal Revisited. In both of these event situations, we provided some educational materials, put together an easy printmaking activity that people could do alongside of learning about who Dox Thrash was, and just connect with the community and hear a lot about people's memories already that they had of maybe Thrash, some people of Shak Muhammad, and others just remembering, what used to be in the neighborhood. Other activities that we've done in the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I almost forgot to mention that with the Free Library, they do have their own collection of Dox Thrash's works that you can check out online or at the main branch. So they have a lot going on there that you can see more of. So we also did another thing that we're trying to do is to celebrate some local Black artists in Philadelphia. And so with this one, we worked with Rod Jones, who's also a printmaker. We did a screen print workshop as part of a celebration with the John Coltrane House, which took place at the Hatfield House in Fairmount Park. And we had done a second community event also, I believe, in Fairmount Park to celebrate the African-American horsemen of Strawberry Mansion. And so here, Rod brought out, he made some silk screens, and we were able to put, people could bring their own things. We also provided some canvas bags and t-shirts. People could screen print their own pieces of Dox Thrash's works. Rod also is very good at marbling paper, and so he taught us how to do that as well. In the next slide, so we also, as we mentioned, we're working with Beach Community Services. Beach's programs focus on a holistic approach to community development. This includes empowering residents by promoting homeownership and rental opportunities through rehabilitation and new construction, education, job placement, economic development, human services, and the beautification of open spaces. We're pretty excited to partner with them in the preservation of the Dox Thrash House. And that is the end of our presentation. We're very pleased to have come and talk to you about.
I'm gonna stop.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. David, do you have a sign off for us before we take questions?
Yes, I just wanted to say that was a wonderful PowerPoint presentation. Really gave us the whole scope of their project and in-depth history of Dox Thrash and his involvement as an artist and a member of the community. So we thank all four of you. I think Maya is kind of the missing link here, but she's going to make an appearance in the Q&A. So I turn it back to you, David. Okay, you're going to be the moderator of this Q&A session. Incidentally, David Soffa is an artist in his own right. He is a fine arts photographer, and he's on the faculty of the Moore College of Art. And he does some great printmaking in his own way. So David, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. You're definitely overselling me, but I'll take it. Thank you.
You deserve it. You deserve
it. And thank you to our fabulous presenters for that illuminating talk. I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, at this time, we will take questions. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can enter your questions in the chat. You can also use the raise hand function. Zoom just did an update where they folded the raise hand into the reactions button. So if you press that and then press raise hand, you can raise your hand to speak and to voice your question. If you can't figure that out, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask us. So if someone would like to start us off, I could also ask a question I've been waiting to ask. Just in terms, you mentioned to the panelists, you mentioned that the library has some of Dox Thrash's works to check out. Did you mean his actual prints, or is it books of Dox Thrash's work?
So you can't, yeah. So the answer is yes and no. So you may request, they do have a collection of his actual prints. But you can't like check them out at the library and like hang it on your wall. You have to, but you can request to go and view them whenever you like, and they'll kind of pull them, and you have to kind of like make an appointment and whatever. But I think they do also have a copy of, I think it's like, I think it's like the Dox Thrash Revealed or whatever, which is like the main book about him that you can check out from the library and read about him and his life.
Wonderful.
They also have a lot of it available online. They're digitized, and you can search the library website and find them there too.
There's also other collections in the city. The PMA is the same as well. You can find that stuff online, or request opportunity to go see them in person. I highly recommend to go see them in person. I got an opportunity to stop by the library today to see the Greatest Number, their recent and current exhibition. And I saw Ship Fitters, which is my favorite. I'm not sure anybody's familiar with it, but it was in the presentation. I saw it in person, and it's even better. So please go visit that exhibition, but also that stuff is online. And if you can see it in person, take the opportunity to.
Amazing, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mitchell here. Yeah, I had a question on the last view of the Dox Thrash House. I didn't see an historic plaque like we see all over Center City at some of these old homes that well-known people resided. If that's the case, then there's no historical marker from the state of Pennsylvania. Is that something that could be in the offering?
Yeah, we do, and we have talked with Beach Community Services, which is the developer, and we do have a little bit of funding to make that happen. And luckily, we have Allie on our team, so it might happen sooner rather than later. But yes, questions about actually nominating the house nationally, and also it's already locally designated, and then getting a historical marker and what that commemoration looks like is something that we are working on as we start looking towards what the development is and how it evolves for the projects.
It's an interesting story.
Yes.
His life.
Great.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I think I was just going to add to that, I think, one of the things we're also thinking about is like, is there any kind of way, we're also not just preservationists, but we're designers as well. So of course we're, kind of trying to engage the community a little bit to talk about, hey, what is this marker? What kind of marker should it be? Should it be something more than just a plaque? Does it involve something that is interactive? I think, we've been looking at an outgrowth of, there's a group called Tiny WPA, and they're working at the library right now and in the neighborhood, and they have a Play Everywhere grant. And so there's been some community design efforts to come up with interactive sort of historic markers for kids and also but adults. And So it's there's a lot of kind of interest in these kinds of markers and what they can be doing besides just kind of being like the traditional blue and yellow plaque. And, you know, I would say like, you know, definitely check out Tiny WPA, who's headed by a man named Alex Gideon. They're builders, and they also have a program that, you know, helps educate youth through building things and learning how to build, which is very much in line with sort of the self-resilience of neighborhood legacies that we think is very important.
Great. We do have one question from the chat, which is, so what exactly is the state of the building as far as the protection from further deterioration?
An excellent question. It has been open to the elements for quite a few years. The photo in our presentation that showed the current conditions of the building, it is exposed to the elements. It has been for the last 3 years, I think. And currently there are, I think there's a gate and fencing around the back, so no one goes into the house or in the property. In the front, the windows are protected by wood pieces that are covering the windows. We are of the opinion, well, I'll speak for myself, that's not enough protection for this building. And so we are hoping to work with Beach, pending what the architectural plans are and what the development is going to be, to kind of make sure that we're doing a phase 1 kind of structuring and protection of the building moving forward. Beach has been able to acquire quite a lot of money for funding for this building. I think we're at 650 or maybe something like that. It might be $1 million, I'm not sure. But there is a lot of funding towards the development of this building, and they are on board to make sure that whatever is salvageable, especially that front facade, is up to standards as far as the criteria for preservation moving forward.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's super important to keep that protected, especially with all this weather we've been having. Okay, we have time for just a few more questions. If anyone has questions.
Yes, I have a question. Yes, Nancy Weinberg. Is the Charles Blackson collection at Temple University a resource also for Dox Thrash?
So I've heard so many good things about this collection. I've yet to visit it myself. I don't know if any other of my team members have, but I have not personally utilized it. There have been some, the general collection at Temple we've used for archival pictures and stuff like that, but visiting that particular collection is definitely on my to-do list to kind of see what else is there. The Pyramid Club was such a huge resource for Black artists in this time period and contemporary to Dox Thrash. I think it's really super important to kind of put that all in context. Dox Thrash wasn't working in a vacuum. He did have other contemporaries that were in that neighborhood, took photos of that neighborhood and participated in Sharswood. And I think broadening that history and that story kind of strengthens our case about Sharswood being on par as like a Harlem Renaissance in New York City, because you have so many artists working there. And I think that collection is going to be really, really key to kind of looking at that and seeing what other artwork was collected and who else was there during this time period.
Well, I appreciate that as being the case. I'm going to continue to recommend the Charles Blackson collection to you. It's a significant one.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Amazing presentation. I'm Bill Whitaker.
Oh, librarian for Penn.
And I think you guys are doing a terrific job about, yeah. Are there artists that, that worked with Thrash or knew him? I mean, I know of one who I was talking with, a week ago, and that kind of voice of what he meant to other artists is an interesting one. And I'm wondering if you've found success in finding those voices and how that, might contribute to or might be useful to the work that you're trying to accomplish.
That is significant. I would love to hear that. I think Mark Collins is on this call. He might be. I'm not sure. I don't want to call him out. Mark Collins is here. So finding and talking to people in the neighborhood, remember, Dox Thrash has been a fascinating and fun, like the best part of this job for us. We have not spoken to any artists who knew Dox Thrash. A lot of the people that we talked to have known the second owner and his activism in the community. But yeah, we're looking for other printmakers, particularly Black printmakers in this community. The community of printmaking is a small one as it is. And folks who know about his legacy, we would love to talk to. That's fascinating to us.
Well, I'm at Penn, you know where to reach me.
Yes.
But it's Bill Hudson, who's a really amazing out in Lancaster, but he met him in 50s or 60s of the individual. And maybe his stories are not so long, but on the other hand, he's a living voice to say that this individual mattered, and that it's a different kind of message that's different from what you guys are talking about, and helps make it more expansive. So again, I just wanted to say it's amazing what you guys are doing, and so articulate in how you're presenting the story. So congratulations.
Thank you. Mark has his hand raised, and I do want to give him the opportunity to kind of speak, because he did share his story with me about meeting Dox Thrash, and I think it would be cool if he shared it here too as well.
Hi, Maya.
Hi.
It's me, Mark, and thanks for making sure I got on this today. You and I have been talking a little bit. I met Dox, I guess I was 5 or 6 years old. My aunt and her husband, Dr. Esther McIntosh Robbins, or Dr. Esther Robbins McIntosh, and my Uncle David were personal friends at Dox Thrash, and his last studio actually was in their building. So I guess I was 5 or 6, and I can see him in my mind's eye looking at me, sort of smiling, and me looking at him in awe. So I'm working with Maya. I don't want to get too far ahead of some things. The young lady was discussing the Blackson collection at Temple University. Technically, I think my aunt has the largest collection of Dox Thrash of almost 400 pieces. So again, I don't want to. I'm talking with Maya and her group, and we're going to collaborate with this whole idea of preservation, because the collection needs to be preserved. There's some other big name educational institutions that are involved that I've shared with Maya and her group that are very, very, very serious about the preservation of the collection. So with that said, thanks for inviting me at Maya, and I look really, really, really forward to making sure this happens.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks.
Thank you for showing it. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? And remember, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute. David, I believe you had a question.
Yes, I do. This can be answered by any one or several of the four. But I noticed that there's a vacant lot next door. I assume it's still vacant. Do you have a vision for what might be built there? Ideally, you may not have too much control over the matter, or maybe you do have some influence. But what are your thoughts on that matter? And also, there's, I think, a site on the other side of the adjacent building. So what might happen there in the future that would really be supportive of the Dox Thrash House, architecturally and historically?
That's a tough question, mostly because, it really is just kind of, out of your control, when, someone else owns the house. And it's really kind of a question of, if they're going to talk to you or not, and if you know who they are.
Right. I was hoping they had some influence,
Yeah.
Emotionally.
I think there's generally, everyone wants this, they've definitely been talked in almost every, neighborhood meeting or collaboration talk that we've done. The conversation has always gone to, well, what do you do right around the house? And I think, and we've had multiple scenarios, like hypothetical scenarios where, you talk about, all the different kind of programming opportunities that open up as you kind of put together pieces. And I think right now for us, it's definitely like keep the options open, and I think, really the vacant lot right now really has more of a, maybe more of like a pop-up kind of opportunity for the house than anything else, especially if when you're talking about having some kind of impact right away, something you can do without a lot of investment, or like, a lot of having to just, get the whole building kind of cycle going in construction. Something a little bit more tactical, which is what we've kind of, found with, working on the other side of the buildings with the library. I will say, like, the house next door that is constructed, it was in need of repair and restoration. And, while it's definitely not part of the project yet, did undergo a number of constructions for rehabilitation, or at least stabilization recently.
Thank you. If there's no one else, I have another question I can address to Chris. And we discussed this informally before the Zoom meeting. One of Dox Thrash's illustrations, was a print, showed the corner of 24th and Ridge Avenues, a very charming image with old cars, I guess from the 20s or 30s, and someone crossing the street. Now, at that very intersection, 24th and Ridge, now you find the immense new offices of the PHA, the Philadelphia Housing Authority, which has been placed there as a part of their plan for the renovation, the reconstruction, the renewal of Sharswood. And again, I address the question: do you think that the placement of that big office building and adjacent amenities, a shopping center and some residences, do you think that's going to assist the revitalization of Sharswood? A difficult question. You don't have to
David
say
with the
question.
Oh my goodness. I have my opinion, and I don't know what my colleagues' opinions are.
Maybe Maya, you're the best person to answer the question because you live not too far from that intersection. You live in, you told me, Strawberry Mansion, which is an adjacent neighborhood. But, so that's really part of the world.
So initially, the way this project started for me, myself, and Dana was part of, in our studies at University of Pennsylvania. This was a studio project for us. We looked in depth at the redevelopment process for PHA. And we're looking for the historic resources that were missing or there that they possibly were missing. They had released their plan. And then Dana and I would walk around the neighborhood and see all this eminent domain signs everywhere. And it kind of looked kind of grim in 2016. Fast forward to now in 2021, there's a lot happening. There's a lot of development happening. I've known, and this just recently happened, like 2020, 2021. It's been like really, really strong. And I know for a long time, it had remained empty for a long time. And I think part of that is because PHA owns so much land in this particular community. They were able to keep at bay a lot of the developers that were around Temple and Fairmont area at the time, and kind of pick and choose who can come in and come out. And that gave them the time to kind of talk to community and work with community in a certain way. They didn't do a very good job and got kind of ridiculed when they started. My opinion is that because they're a federal agency, they're not embedded in the city. They report to HUD and further up. I think they could do a better job in participating in what's happening locally and citywide. They have a lot more power than the city has as far as usurping land and taking over neighborhoods. And I think they need to find their balance in between that. I think a grocery store is needed. I know a lot of people in the community are not happy with the choice of vendor for a grocery store. But I think what's missing culturally from this neighborhood needs to be put back. And part of the reason why Dana, I, and Chris and Allie, there's something that's missing there that went away, that PHA is ignoring, and that's the cultural legacy of this neighborhood. And I think, grocery stores are needed. I think parking lots are great. I think parks are definitely something that's needed. And I think the arts are just going to round it out and kind of bring it in there for us. That was a long-winded answer. But PHA, I think because of at the level that they work with, which is the federal level, is doing the best that they can. They have a lot of money. We've been participating in a lot of meetings with them as far as the reconstruction and development of this neighborhood. And it's certainly interesting to see. I think for us, this has been a case study for us to try to find out what's the best way to do this moving forward, and if this is something that can be replicated in other communities. So that's how we're looking at it and working with all the partners in that neighborhood. Sorry for the long answer, but that's my opinion. And Dana and Allie and Chris might have their own. Yeah.
I think mine is, I guess, similar. I would say that, there's definitely I think an intention, behind sort of the land grabbing. And, there's, as I've kind of evolved since Penn into my professional career, I'm kind of becoming more familiar with another type of preservation, which is the preservation of affordable housing and affordability, which gets talked about a lot in affordable housing circles. And I think that was an intent from the PHA, but the drawback is that because they kind of are the primary landholder of almost all the available land, it kind of makes it hard for individuals to build equity or even reclaim equity that, maybe their family or they once had. And I think that's probably maybe one thing they could do a better job at is I think they're used to sort of a top-down model. I think one phase of Sharswood history that we didn't really get to discuss in our presentation was sort of the public housing development. So in the 60s, shortly after the Columbia Avenue uprising, the Philadelphia Housing Authority demolished, I think it was about 9 blocks of row houses right in the middle of Sharswood and built 2 large public housing towers. So that was the first taking that they had in the neighborhood. And so if you kind of think about the PHA's history and everything, they sort of top-down models of development is really all they know. But they could certainly do a better job at trying to engage and include individuals and kind of try to build more self-determination. And I think one thing that is good to some degree is that what they have done is bought time, and that was also desperately needed, because on the other hand, if they hadn't done that, that neighborhood for sure would have been completely gentrified by now. So I can't completely demonize it, but it's also not doesn't get a gold star either. So
Great.
Well, I could, I think that you did your best to answer my question about PHA and their involvement in the neighborhood. There's no one answer, and their ultimate success is something remains to be seen in the future. So, David, are there any other questions that are looming on Zoom?
We have just nothing but admiration for the presenters in the chat. No other questions at this time.
Well, if there are any questions, that we'll conclude our Zoom. It's just about 8 o'clock, 1 hour. I want to thank all the participants, Maya, Chris, Ali, and Dana. You've done a wonderful job, and urge you to continue your good work into the future. Your work will never be done in this field, but simply persevere and continue.
Well, and thank you, David.
Yeah.
And thank you to the entire SOS group for giving us a forum tonight.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. You're all very, very welcome. I really appreciate your participation. As to the future, Save Our Sites, well, that's going to be next year, which is not too long off. Probably in January we'll take a little hiatus, but later in the winter, we'll have more lectures, more Zoom lectures. And as we always do in early June, we're going to have a tour outdoors. I don't have to say weather permitting because the site that we have in mind has some indoor spaces, but I won't tell you what it is. It will be announced. So that's what's forthcoming. Also, I want to tell you that this Zoom has been recorded, and we will let you know how it will be available. We'll send out the link in an email probably late in January, early February. So anyway, have a happy holiday season and a great new year, healthy, happy, and full of good preservation work, and good night.